Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Barbara Keshen. Most of you probably know that until 1973, when the United States Supreme Court decided Roe versus Wade, abortion was illegal in most of the United States. And now, of course, under the new Dobbs decision, most of abortion is illegal in the United States. In order for me to prepare for this sermon, this service, I reread Roe, and I read the Dobbs decision. You can all thank me very much for having done that. And I have two quick thoughts about them. The first is that both of them are very thin opinions. Not a lot of reasoning, not a lot of legal thought went into either of those decisions. And the second one is that whatever those decisions about, they weren't about women. Women are hardly mentioned in any of either of those decisions. Here is the one paragraph from Roe versus Wade that actually talks about what the right to abortion might mean for the life of a woman. The right of privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. The detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice is altogether apparent. Specific and direct harm, medically diagnosable even in early pregnancy, may be involved. Maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed by child care. There's also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child. And there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable psychologically and otherwise to care for it. In other cases, as in this one, the additional difficulties and continuing stigma of unwed motherhood may be involved. All these are factors the woman and her responsible physician necessarily will consider in consultation. End of discussion of women. You know, as you get inspiration from many sacred texts, and I'm going to read from the sacred text today of the New Yorker magazine. This is from the New Yorker magazine of October 17, 2022, and it's from an article that's called "The Abortion Underground. Post-Roe, a Mexican activist helps American women defy the law." And it's by a woman named Stefania Taladrud. The handoff was planned for a late afternoon on a weekday at an underused trailhead in a Texas park. The young woman carrying the pills, whom I'll call Anna, arrived in advance of the designated time, as was her habit, to throw off anyone who might try to use her license plate to trace her identity. She felt slightly absurd in her disguise: sun hat, oversized glasses, a plain black mask. But the pills in her pocket were used to induce abortions, and in Texas, her home state, their distribution now required such subterfuge, along with burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. Since late June, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, Texas and 13 other states have effectively banned abortion, and more were sure to follow. In some of the states, laws that originated as far back as the 19th century have been restored. Providing the tools for an abortion in Texas had become a felony that could lead to years in prison, and a fellow citizen could sue Anna and collect upwards of $10,000 for every abortion she was found to abet. Thank you, choir. That was perfect. So this sermon is called Back to the Future, and I thought I should start by taking a few minutes to kind of go back and look what the future was like before Roe was decided in 1973. What was this country like for a woman in the heady days of the Eisenhower and Nixon inaugurations, which is about the area that we're talking about? Well, it was pretty conventional. You know, think the Donna Reed Show, think Leave It to Beaver, think about those kinds of systems where the man went off to work, the woman stayed home and raised the children, and everyone was happy, living in a little home, and everyone was heterosexual, and life was good. And that was all well and good for people who fit into that mold and who liked that mold and who wanted that life. For people, especially women, who did not fit that mold and who did not want that life, life was pretty tough. All the pressures were funneling you into a certain stream. And if you couldn't swim in that stream, you were going to suffer. If, for instance, you were a single woman, or if, for instance, you were a divorced woman and you were trying to make a living, the options weren't a lot for you. They were pretty narrow. You could pretty much be a school teacher, a nurse, or a secretary, not high-paying jobs. If you needed money to live, you couldn't get credit as a single woman. You couldn't get a mortgage as a single woman. You were being pressured into a certain kind of very narrow life. If you found yourself in a marriage that was difficult for you, it was really hard to get out of it. The divorce laws weren't your friend. And if you managed to get yourself out of a divorce, a situation that was bad in a marriage, like my mother did in 1956, there weren't a lot of options. We moved back home to our grandparents' one-bedroom apartment. My grandparents slept in the bedroom. My sister and I, at night, the den was converted to a bedroom for us. And my mother slept in the living room couch for years, no privacy whatsoever. So life was pretty narrow for women back in those age. And if your marriage was an abusive marriage, even worse. No shelters, no police to help you. Even if you were raped by your husband, too bad. The law did not recognize marital rape in a marital bedroom. That didn't change in Massachusetts until 1980. My friend is here, who I was a prosecutor with in Essex County. And it was in Essex County, Massachusetts, where our colleague, Diane Kottmeyer, brought the first case that finally recognized marital rape in Massachusetts, 1980. So things were pretty narrow back then. And if you had an unwanted pregnancy, well, that was just tough. There were very few places where you could get an abortion. If you could, it was hard to afford it. People resorted, as you know, to back alley abortions back then. Nothing mattered. It didn't matter if you were carrying your rapist's child. It didn't matter if you were sick and bearing that child may cost you your own life. That was just too bad. And that was the status of women back before Roe in the 1960s and 70s. So how did this play out in real life for real life women? When I got to be the legal director for the New Hampshire Civil Liberties Union, you take a new job and for a couple of weeks you have nothing to do. So one of the things that I did was look back in our files to see what kind of cases historically the New Hampshire Civil Liberties Union had handled. And I came across a case that involved it was a 1970 case that involved a doctor who had been prosecuted for providing an abortion where the patient had died. And I want to tell you that story because this is what real life looked like for women back in the pre-Roe days. This is where we're going back to right now. The story starts in 1970, and there's a woman named Mary Ellen Cann. She was 27 years old. She had been born in Somersworth, New Hampshire, had lived her life in New Hampshire. She was a teacher now in she taught English at Dover High School. And in March of that year, she had been divorced. And it was divorce from what her husband told the police was a loveless marriage. Not sure what that meant. And her friends told the police, look, it was a good divorce for her. She was living in her own apartment. She had a job that she loved. She was teaching. She loved the kids. She was in the first chapter of her new life. She was a happy woman who was going forward with her life. And in March, that was in March that she got divorced. In May of that year, after she had started dating, she realized that she was pregnant. And she did not tell her parents about it, but she did tell her friends. And she talked with her friends about the pros and cons and about what having a child out of wedlock would mean for her. You know, they realized that she would lose her job because no one in those days was going to keep a woman employed, an unwed mother was not going to be a high school teacher. She was going to have to lose her apartment. She moved back in with her parents the way my mother did. I mean, her life that was just starting would unravel thread by thread by thread. So Mary Ellen made the decision to seek an abortion. And she and her friend, a woman by the name of Ann Fager, none of these names are changed. These are real people. Ann Fager and Mary Ellen Cann went to see a doctor practiced in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a psychiatrist and a physician whose name was Dr. Joyce Millett. And Dr. Joyce Millett agreed to help them. And she agreed to get a prescription for a saline solution. And she showed Ann Fager, Mary Ellen's friend, how to inject Mary Ellen with that saline solution in order to induce an abortion. Ann Fager did that. And a couple of days after she did that, they called Dr. Millett because things were not going well. Mary Ellen was in a lot of pain. She was hemorrhaging. Would Dr. Millett please come to Mary Ellen's apartment? And she did. And when she got to Mary Ellen's apartment, she realized that things were very bad. And she made the decision to have Mary Ellen entered into the hospital in York, Maine under a false name. It had to be a false name. Mary Ellen went to York Hospital and she died the next day. So Dr. Joyce Millett was charged with second-degree murder. Ann Fager, a school teacher in another district, was charged with second-degree murder for helping her friend to get an abortion. So 3 lives were ruined that day. 3 lives. Dr. Millett, although she ultimately wasn't prosecuted, thanks to the ACLU, was exiled from Massachusetts. I don't know really what happened to her. Ann Fager, don't know what happened to her, but she had to live with knowing that she was the person that injected her friend, and her friend died. And of course, Mary Ellen Cann was killed. Mary Ellen Cann didn't die because of the choices that she made. Mary Ellen Cann died because of the choices the society made for her. Back to the Future. So I've known that I wanted to share this story ever since the Dobbs decision came down, because it's such an object lesson. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to share it, and then Betsy asked me to do a service here for the church. So I said I agreed to do it. And I started to tell some of my friends this story about Mary Ellen Cann, and I wondered what their reaction was going to be. I told this story to two friends of mine that both coincidentally had gone to the same college that I did, Connecticut College. One of them was a classmate of mine. One of them was a little older. And after I told them the story about Mary Ellen Cann, both of them said to me, "Barbara, I haven't told anyone about this in 50 years, but this happened to me too." Both of them, it turned out, became pregnant when they were in college. Neither of them told their parents. In both cases, that we weren't talking about one-night stands or we weren't talking about sexual assaults. In both cases, it was by the boyfriend that they were with, had been with for a long time, and ultimately did marry. But neither of them felt ready to give up college, to give up their futures, to have a child. And what could they do? They found people who knew people, and they told me the same story. They would make these phone calls. There was coded language, and one of them went to New York City. One of them went to Puerto Rico, alone, scared, not knowing the person they were putting in whose hands they were putting their life, and terminated their pregnancies. And neither of them had spoken about it for 50 years. So that got me thinking, what kept them silent for so long? Why is it that they didn't talk about it? And what I think it's about was that it's about shame. And shame is a really powerful emotion. And this same society that was so good at keeping women financially dependent on men and in the home was really good at shaming women. And they have been, this culture has been good at shaming people for a long, long time. It's as old as the Bible. The names harlot, wench, more recently slut, trash, whore. That kind of shame, those kind of shameful names, even if they're not said to you, can be internalized. And I think that that's what was going on for my friends. By the way, where are the derogatory terms for men who impregnate? And I imagine as you're listening to this now, many of you might be thinking about particular women in your life who you know have had to make this decision. And I'm thinking about three people in particular. One of them was a colleague of mine in the Essex County District Attorney's Office in the early 80s. She was in her 40s. She was married, a long-term marriage. She had 2 children that were now grown up so that she could go back to school and pursue a career that she absolutely loved. She was one of the happiest people I have ever met. Really a lot of fun to be around. And one day she called me up and said, "Barbara, will you come to lunch with me?" And she started to cry, and she told me that she was pregnant. She was traumatized. She was distraught. She didn't want to have to go back and raise a second family. I'm thinking about my sister, who, when she was in high school, left a little note that my mother found that had the name of a clinic and a time on it. She was pregnant. She didn't tell my mother. My mother just happened to find the note, went with her to the clinic, and that's the reason that my sister was not all by herself alone. having an abortion when she was, 16, 17 years old. And to be frank, I'm thinking about myself. 1970, the same year that Mary Ellen died, I graduated from college. I worked for the summer as a waitress, saved up $1,000, bought a round-trip ticket, an open-ended trip to Europe, and went essentially so that I could avoid becoming an adult for another year, having to make adult decisions. Went over, I was in Scotland and met someone, had my very first sexual encounter. 6 weeks later, I'm in a hostel in Greece, and I woke up in a pool of blood. And I didn't think about it, didn't realize until decades later what had happened, that I had a miscarriage. And that miscarriage was an act of grace, because it kept me from having to make that kind of horrible decision. And I imagine that there might be women now who are sitting here listening to this thinking, this is very personal for me. I know this story. I too had to make this decision. I too was too old to have a child, too poor to have a child, too young to have a child. I've been carrying this weight around with me for years. And I want you to know that if that is you, and you have been carrying this weight around, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You made the decision that you needed to make at the time that was in your best interest, in the best interest of your family. You did what you needed to do, and it was okay. It was fine. You were not a bad person. You were not a selfish person. You had every right to think about your future and the kind of future you wanted for yourself and the people that you loved. You don't need to hold this in any longer. And women aren't holding in shame any longer. And that's one of the things that the lawmakers have realized, that shame isn't going to keep people silent any longer. So what is? Maybe criminal laws. And criminal laws have kept people silent for a long, long time. In the 1960s and the 1970s, there were a group of women in Chicago who got together, and they learned how to perform abortions themselves. And they called themselves the Jane Collective, and they offered their services for free to women who needed abortions and could not otherwise get one, and especially to women who had no other resources, who were poor. And they attracted attention. Many of those women were prosecuted. Many of them were imprisoned. And so were many others. Anne Fager could have gone to prison as a murderer. Dr. Joyce Millett could have gone to prison as a murderer, all because she wanted to provide health care to her patients. Good and caring people were sent to prison for the simple act of caring for other human beings and wanting to help them. And as the New Yorker article makes clear, the criminal laws are back today with a vengeance. Women like the Anne in the New Yorker story, who provides abortion pills, she could be prosecuted. She could be sent to prison. The people who provide the pills for her to distribute could be prosecuted, could go to prison. People who fund them, even, people who give donations for the pills to go to women, could be prosecuted as criminal racketeers and go to prison for trying to help women who need help. So Back to the Future means we're going to see more Dr. Milletts. We're going to see more Ann Fagers. And worst of all, we're going to see more Mary Ellen Kahns. And it's not like the government in those states have said that have criminalized abortion. They're not anti-choice. They are not anti-choice. They have made their choice. They choose the life of an unborn fetus over a living, breathing woman. And so that brings us to the heart of the matter here, and that is misogyny. That is the motor that drives the pro-life movement. It's not about the life of the unborn. If it were about the life of the unborn, there would be free prenatal care. There would be free medical care for women who give birth. There would be free lunches. There would be free nursery schools, daycare. There would be all kinds of support. It is not about the life of the child. What is about is pure, old-fashioned misogyny. So what is misogyny? Webster's defines it as a hatred of women, but I think it's really more like a dislike of, a contempt of, or an ingrained prejudice against women. At its most benign, and it's universal. It's universal. I don't know why, but it is universal. At its most benign, misogyny would say, well, women need to be guided and protected by men. Women are too emotional, they're too immature, they're too delicate to, fill in the blank, to work in a factory, to work in an office, to hold office, to make their own damn decisions. They need men's guidance. Misogyny bound the feet of Chinese women. Misogyny amputated the clitorises of African girls in rituals. Misogyny is what keeps Arab women covered from head to toe, their identity erased as human beings. And misogyny is what prohibits schoolgirl-aged children, girls, from getting education. That is misogyny. And in our country, it was misogyny that kept women in those narrow little pathways of motherhood, wifehood, death. And misogyny kills. Here's the statistics about, and these are actually kind of shocked me, but about 1 out of 3 women will have an abortion in her lifetime. And if safe and effective abortion is illegal, many of those women will die. For white women, about 25% of deaths that are attributed to childbirth are actually the result of abortions that have gone wrong. And for women of color, who more often have to resort to self-administered procedures, think coat hangers, that number is closer to 50%. 50% of women of color who they say died of childbirth actually died of botched abortions. And it's time to be blunt. Anyone who is okay with those numbers is a misogynist. So why am I talking about this in church? Why should we be talking about this in church? Our faith compels us to do everything we can to keep abortion safe and legal in New Hampshire and to advocate for safe and legal abortions in the rest of the country and in the rest of the world. Why? Our faith calls on us to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And we cannot answer that call and yet deny women bodily integrity. We cannot answer that call and stand by as governments force women to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term and then punish them when they don't. We cannot answer that call and know that some courageous people will be sent to prison for helping our sisters. And we cannot answer that call and know that too many of our sisters will die needlessly for lack of adequate care. Our faith calls on us to promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And we cannot answer that call and yet force women to sacrifice their dreams and their futures. We cannot answer that call and yet force a woman to bear a child only to go through the additional pain of giving it up for abortion or keeping an unwanted child, and the reason they're unwanted is that you're too poor, you cannot afford to feed it. We are called to act. This is a painful and uncomfortable subject. And for some, it may have dislodged and opened a wound, and I'm sorry. But it is exactly the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about and talking about at church. Thank you.